Hello guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Mike Matthew KE and this is my programming series. So far we've been looking at different concepts in programming, and the last time we did a bit of an example of everything we've covered so far. So today we're going to be looking at variable scope, something that I've been mentioning over time, but we haven't really looked deeply at it so that we can know what exactly it entails. So we're going to be going deeply into variable scope, and by definition, variable scope is basically um, defining the area or section within your code where a certain variable can be modified or it's accessible. Okay, so we are going to dive right into the code. We'll start with C++. Okay, as usually do C++ versus Python. So we'll start with C++ today, and here we go. So variable scope. So of course we know what a variable is. So for example, if I declare an integer x and give it the value 2 here, this is how we declare a variable. Defining a variable. So in terms of scope, this means that we have x as a global variable. It is basically in the global scope. That means anywhere within this file, we can access this variable x. Okay, so that's something that we call the global scope. And then now we have now our local scope, or better defined in C++, we can call it the block scope. It basically means anything that you define within these curly braces is within a specific block. So if you have a function, then we have this block as the scope of that function. So for example, if we come into this function, um, and we write int y equals 3, then this y is within the block scope, within this scope of this function. So if I come here and I print out um, y, if you print out y, of course you'll get the value 3. So now what happens if I change this to x, and then we print this to x? So you see we've already defined int x out here, which is our global variable, and then we create another x in here, and we try to print it out. Okay, so if I run this, the value that we get is 3. So first of all, you would ask yourself, why has Python allowed us to, why has C++ allowed us to declare this variable twice? The difference is they're in different scopes. So this value of x is only viable within the scope of this main function. This value x, which is 3, is only viable within this main function. If I came up here and tried to print out the value of x before we declared the new value of x, then it will take the global variable values. Why? Because this is accessible anywhere within the code. However, whenever we declare another variable within a block scope that has the same name as a global variable, then C++ will take precedence on the blocked variable, the one that is within this block. So if I try to run this, you see we get 2 and 3. Why? It was the first time it was printing the global variable, the second time it was printing the local variable after we have declared it. So let's try to take this into a different function. Okay, so instead of doing this, we'll just create another function which will not return anything. So let's say test variable, let's call it that, and then we'll declare our variable int x equals 2 here, and then we'll print out x, and that's all that will happen at this stage. Okay, and then here we'll first call test var, and then now we'll print out the value of x. So So in this case, what happens is we'll have test var running first. So our first print, or rather, let me have this. Let me have this printed out. So that we can see the difference here. Sorry for that. So that we can see the difference here. So what is happening here? We'll have our test var printed first, and then we'll have our value here, x, which you expect to be 2 because this is within this block scope. Okay, and then when we look at this main, so main does not have the x variable declared. However, we have this global variable which will be accessible anywhere within the code. So expect the value to be 2 as well. So I'll just change this test var to 3 so that you have a difference between the global and the block variable. So if I run this, then we get our test var is 3 and our main var is 2. Again, if I remove this declaration, just like we had before in the main function, then we'll see that our test var is 2 and our main var is 2. Why? Because since we have not declared another variable that has the same name as x, then our x variable here in this test var will take the value of the global variable. So another scenario we can do, let's say we try to change the value of x here. So the question is, will the value of x change if we try to change it within this scope? So in this case, what will happen is, since we have only x declared at the global scope, then our value of x will change accordingly. So if I run this, we'll see that 3 is printed on both because we've changed the value of x when it's a global variable. And then that's what we're using within our function and also within our main function and within our test var function. So that's the result that we definitely get. So another question you would ask yourself is this scope also applicable when it comes to if statements and for loops, since they also use these curly braces? And the answer is yes. So if I create another scope here, so let me give this let me make sure that this is a block scope for this function, and then let me create another variable x within this scope and call it 4. Then and give it the value 4. So I'll just name this as a block variable when I'm printing so that we know which x we're referring to. So if I run this, then you'll see that we'll get our test variable is 3, our block variable is 4, and our main variable is 2. So since the order here matters, if we try to print this x after this scope, now we'll ask another question here. Will the value of x in this test var change the value of x in this function where we've printed this out? Because remember, we've printed it out after declaring this block scope. So we want to see whether the value of x here will be 4 or it will be 3 as it was originally. So if I run this, you can see that our block variable is 4. However, our test variable does not change. Even though it's within this function, we have declared it within a different block scope, which means that when you declare this variable here, it changes our value in this scope. It creates only x in this scope alone, and that's only what we're manipulating. So that means whether we have our for loop here or we have our if here, whatever happens within this if, whether you declare it or not, it will be only within the scope of that if statement. So that is very important for you to note, okay? And more so if we're doing it in a for loop. Let's say we create a for loop that maybe goes from I equals 0 to I less than, let's say 4 I plus plus. Let's say we do something like this, and then we declare our variable of x as 4, and then we increment x here. right? So I'm just going to comment this out so that we focus specifically on our block scope here. So now, if I run this, so we are iterating 4 times here. So we're expecting that 4 will be printed out, that we have 4, then printed out consistently. So if I try to print this, you can see that we have 4 printed out consistently. You can ask yourself, how come we are incrementing, yet the value of x is not changing as we are looping through? The thing is here, this is our scope, right? So the moment we have started our loop, we declare our variable. So this is when I equals 0. We declare our variable, then we print out, and then we increment the value of x. And then we move to the next loop where we start the scope again, which means this will be redeclared. It's like a new scope. It's a loop, yes, but when I equals 0, is a scope that is different from when I equals 1. Kind of like that, if you think of it that way. Which means this will be redeclared on every loop. So that scope matters. If this x was declared outside of this loop, okay, it already is. So this time we have x already declared as 3. So if I run this, then we'll see that the value of x will be changing over time. Why? Because the scope that we're dealing with for x is outside the loop scope, which means our variable will always be updated within this for loop. And since we're not redeclaring it within the for loop, its value will not be reset as it was being done before. So that's something that you need to note whenever you're doing loops. Wherever you declare your variable is very, very important. So let's try and contrast this with Python, right? So in Python, we also have a global scope. So if you declare something here, let's say x equals 5, and then whenever we declare it outside a function or outside any scope, it means then it is global, which means it's accessible everywhere. So let's create our test scenario here, test variable, of which we can print x. Right? So let's try we declare x as 10 here, and then we call our function test_var, and then we also print x here. Right? So we've declared x as our variable, as our global variable. Then we call our function test_var. So when we call it test_var, we declare another variable called 10, x equals 10, and then we print the value of x, which we expect to be 10. However, the question will be here, what value will we get at this point? Will x have changed to 10, or will x be the value of 5? So let's run this and see. So you can see at first it prints 10, and then it prints 5. So for the sake of clarity, let's make sure we have this here so that we can tell them apart. Test var, and this is, I'll call this main var. So if we try to run this, we can see that the test var remains at 10, and the main var, which is our global variable, basically will still remain at 5. Therefore, our global variable has not changed because of this declaration. Why? This is in our global scope, and then this is in something called our local scope. So in Python, there's basically only these 2 types of scopes. There's the global and the local scope. So this x is a new variable. It is not the same x as this. This x is only declared within this test var. It is only viable within this test var. So it's basically the naming that is the same. So another question I would like to ask yourself is, what if I want to be able to use only the global variable that I've declared? I want to use this global variable, not the local variable. You see, in C++, it's very easy. When you look at C++, the moment you declare it as a new variable using the type definition, then the program will be able to know that this is in a different scope from the global X that you declared here. However, in Python, there's no declaration that we are doing directly so that we can know that for sure. So the way that you can know is by saying global X. You declare this before you give the variable its value. So that means that the X value that we'll use here will be the global value that we already have. So when we have X equals 10 here, then when we print here, we'll get 10, of course. But when we print here, we'll find that the value of X has changed simply because we have said that this value is supposed to be the global value. So if I run this, you'll find that the value is 10 and 10. So the global variable has changed because we've declared that within this function, we want to use X as the global variable and not a new variable that we've defined within this scope. Similarly, we also have, what if you have a function within a function, right? Let's say we have another function. Let's call it test X. And then we declare our variable here, X equals 15. So what happens if we want the value of X here So at first we are printing X in this test X. I'll just make sure we call test X before we print here. So I hope you can see this clearly. So if you look at this, we've created another variable within the another function within this function, and this function we are calling it within test var. So we are changing the value of X to 15 in this case. So if I run this, let me just return this so that we know at what point we are printing. And in this case, I'll just call this X var. So if I run this, you see that the X var is 15 and the test var is 10. Main var is still 10 because we're still using the global variable. So let me remove this global scope so that we can do a bit of a test here. So the question is, what if you wanted to change this value whenever you're doing this? What if you wanted this value X to change whatever is in this scope, the X value that is in this scope? You see, if we use global X here, this will use the globe. So if you use global X here, this will change the global variable. If I run this, then we'll have X var is 15, test var remains as 10 because it is not part of the global variable, and then main var, which is basically a global variable, has been changed now to 15. Maybe it will make more sense if I put this as the global variable. Now our question will is, what if I wanted the X that I'm using here to only change this X that is within this scope? So what we'll do is declare this as non-local. What this will do is, it is saying that this X value is not local to this function. Okay, which means that the next available local scope is this test variable, which has the value as 10. So what we expect here is that when we are printing our X var, it will be 15, and our test var will be 15. However, our global variable will remain as 5. So if I run this, you can see that our X var is 15, our test var is 15, but our global variable remains as 5. So whatever modification we've done in this function, test X, has changed the value of this X within the scope of the test var function. I really hope you're able to follow along with me here so that you understand what's going on. So now, another thing that you can also look at is arguments. So whenever you pass arguments, we want to know what scope is this argument in. Okay. So let's say, for example, we have X being passed as a variable here. So let's pass X there. So I'll just remove this test x. So now we have x being passed as a variable. So we have our global variable being passed to this function here. And then now we're changing the value of x. So you would ask yourself, if I've passed it as an argument, does that mean that it changes the value of the global variable? So let's run this and see the results. So we have test var is 10 and global var is 5. So what's happened here? It's basically our global variable has just passed the value. Here we've only passed the value of the global variable x. We've not passed the the variable itself. We've passed the value that is stored within the global variable. So here this is no different from putting 5 here, because that's the value of x. It's no different from doing this. That's what this is. That's why whenever you pass an argument in Python, the variable does not change in value. The global variable does not change in value. So that's something to also consider whenever you're working with variables in programming. The declared variable here does not represent the actual variable itself. It only represents the value of the variable. Okay, so another question that we can also answer here. So what happens if you want to modify the value? You want to pass this value, change it up however you want within the function, and then modify the global variable later. So something you can do that at the end of this, you can return x and then assign the value x here. So it's just a simple hack compared to doing to declaring this as global x. This might be a bit more confusing compared to doing it this way, where you pass it as an argument and then now you return the value and update the variable. This is probably the best way of doing it. That's the way I prefer to do it, because this is more clear. We are doing some modifications on the value here, and then later we are assigning our new value to our variable, our original variable. So this is probably the best way of doing it whenever you want to do some modifications within a function. And if you run this, then you'll have our global variable has been changed, because that's what you're expecting the function to do, a change, and then the value to be put now to the global variable. This is the better way of doing it compared to using our global keyword here. Okay. In C++, we also have another means of declaring these variables. So it is possible to pass the variable itself by reference. It's something that we call passing by reference. So basically what that means is we've passed a reference to the variable and not the variable itself. And how we do it is by declaring it this way. So we put an ampersand in front of this variable. Just do it this way, right? We put an ampersand in front of the name of the variable. So this means I'm passing this value by reference. Basically, whatever modifications I'm doing here are referencing the original variable, which means any modifications I do here will affect the original variable. So in this case, if I try and run this, we'll see that the test var is 3, but surprise, surprise, our main var, which is our global variable, has been changed to 3. Why? Because we've passed it by reference and not by value. So by default, this is something that you need to note whenever you're doing C++. If you want to pass a variable by value, you declare it normally as we do. But if you want to be able to modify the value of the variable within the function, then you can pass it by reference, and whatever value you assign it here will change the variable here. Now, another thing to note, if you're declaring it by reference, the name need not be the same. So for example, if I call this y instead of x, it does not remove the fact that I've declared it by reference. it's just like I've given the exact same variable a different name within this scope. However, the value here, the value that I give to y will still be given to x because it is passed by reference. It's like a reference to the original variable. So any change I do will change the original x. So if I run this, we'll still get the test var is 3 and the main var is 3, which means the name that you give whenever you pass by reference does not affect does not change the fact that we will change this variable value. So guys, I really hope you have enjoyed this session. I hope you've gotten to learn. This is something very, very important when it comes to variable scope. It's something that can really bring a lot of bugs if you're not very careful with how you you follow your variable scope. It is something very, very important, and you need to follow it whenever you are working with your functions, whenever you're working with your loops. Always look at the variable scope. Where is this variable viable? Okay, where is it usable? It also helps whenever you're naming your variables that you name them accordingly. So for example, if I just come back here, you see that if we declare it here as x, and we have a global variable x, as a programmer it would be hard for me to click in my mind that this x here is different from this x. So the naming also matters. If you declare the naming differently accordingly, naming a variable such that it makes sense to you as you're reading it, then it will be very easy for you to keep track of the scope, because we have a name for that variable that is definitely obviously within a certain scope. Okay, so that's also something that you need to check into as you're doing your variables, as you're writing your programs. Please always look at what is the scope of your variable. Okay, so I really hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you've understood the concept that you've done here, and I hope to see you next time in our next video. See you guys.